Hello and welcome back to another Amber Roots devlog. I'm very excited to show you guys everything I've been working on, so let's hop into the game and see what's changed. The first change is a subtle one, but I finally got the pixel perfect camera working. I've been having some issues with that one for a while. Walking around caused the pixels to do a sort of shimmering effect, and sometimes they would end up at different sizes, but now I think I've got it working a lot smoother. Also, I want to mention that I finally got version control working. That's really exciting for me, knowing that my project is backed up online and that it'll be harder for me to mess something up that can't be rectified. I am by no means an expert on the topic, but I feel like I learned a lot. I'm using GitHub to host my repositories, and I'm using a combination of the Git GUI fork and terminal commands on Visual Studio Code, and it's all working really well. Granted, I'm not getting too fancy with what I'm doing with version control, but it's really nice just having backups of everything I'm doing in the project. Alright, so let's get into the more interesting stuff of what's actually changed in the game. So I've started redoing the way the AI system works. And just to be clear, I'm talking about the AI that controls how monsters move and what they do, not the AI in combat. For Amber Roots, I'm using the A* pathfinding project, and so far it's worked out really well. The big thing I'm working on now is having monsters be able to follow the player, or chase the player depending on the context, I guess. So here you can see what happens when a bunch of monsters start chasing the player. They can navigate around each other and obstacles fairly well, and they only get stuck sometimes. But this is sort of a stress test. There won't really be times when you're getting chased by this many monsters. But this is a good test for a scenario that will happen in the game, which is the player getting chased by wild monsters. My first instinct with wild battles was to make them random. You know, tall grass, the usual stuff. But then I started wondering if I could actually have monsters on the field. Monsters that would chase you and run into you to initiate combat. A lot of modern JRPGs are doing that a lot now, and I have to say, especially having played Dragon Quest XI, being able to see the enemies on the field just feels really good to me. So I'm really hoping I can get this working well. But I don't want all monsters that follow the player to be enemies. I really want the monsters that are currently in your team to be able to follow you around and be seen on the world. So I'm gonna get to work on that now, and I'll catch up soon. So right now it's super simple. I made a prefab of a monster follower, and if you've got monsters in your team, that follower reads it and appears on the world. And this works okay, except for the obvious issue that when you're at your ranch and your monster team is following you, you see two copies of the same monster. The ones that are normally at the ranch and the ones that are following you. Now, I don't plan to have team followers at the ranch. At the ranch, your team monsters should be behaving like all others, where they're walking around, taking care of their needs, and working. This is meant to be more of a feature for when you go out and you take your team to other places. So what I need is to implement a way for the game to detect what area/scene the player is in, and only show team monsters when you're not at the ranch scene. So I'm gonna see if I can tackle that now, and I'll catch up in a bit. Alright, well that was way easier than I thought it would be. Partially because I've already got a lot of functionality set up for scene management in the game. The thing that took me the longest was getting this scene drop down that tells you the name of the scene you've just entered to animate. I'm animating it using tweening, but getting it to come and go to the right locations took me way longer than I thought it would. The next thing I tackled was trying to get those followers that I showed earlier to actually only show up on certain scenes. And honestly, this was the easy part. Once I could recognize which scene was which, it was just a matter of turning the followers on and off, and moving them to the location of the player on scene changes. Personally, I think it's working really well. They have a list of scenes that they're not allowed in, and when one of those scenes is the current scene, then they just turn themselves off. Before I move on from this, there's just a couple more things I want to fix and add, and then we'll be able to do some wild monster stuff. Okay, so first of all, I added some local avoidance so that the monsters will move slightly away from the player when you get close enough. This is to avoid the player getting stuck. I also made it so that when you hold down Shift, the interaction between the colliders for the player and the monsters is no longer taking place, meaning that now the player can walk right through them. That, coupled with the fact that they still try to avoid you a bit, I think will make it pretty hard for the player to get stuck on the monsters. A couple of other changes. Now you can interact with the monsters just like you could at your ranch. Now, the interaction menu needs to be completely overhauled at some point, but at least now the infrastructure is there so that when you're out with your team, you can still interact with them, feed them, etc. I also improved how moving monsters handle obstacles, and they have an easier time going around them and finding their way to you. However, if they do happen to get stuck, now when they get far away enough from the player, they warp to them. So that should ensure that nobody gets permanently stuck anywhere, and that about does it for the monster followers for now, I think. So I'm pretty happy with this, and I think the next step is working on wild encounters, having wild monsters out in the field that will chase you down and attack you. Alright, so let me show you what I've come up with. I'm out here wandering in the forest with my team, and there is a new monster on the scene, and this monster is wild. Firstly, let's do a little bit of an introduction. This monster is named Javelini, and he will be the baby form of the boar monster family. So looking back at the forest, these monsters are being spawned by the monster spawner, which is a sort of monster den. The monster spawner takes in several variables, like what kind of monster to spawn and how many. It also determines what area to spawn the monsters in. And it uses object pooling in order to cycle through spawned monsters. The nice thing about this object pooler that I'm using for this monster spawner is that I can technically use it for any kind of prefab. So it doesn't have to be monsters, it could be any kind of game object. I may end up extending this system for things like gatherables and such. For anyone interested, I used the Brackeys object pooling tutorial and just made a few modifications of my own so that it better fits my project. Also, if you get too close to one of these wild monsters, they start to chase you. Now, for the purposes of this demonstration, I made it really slow, so it's easy to outrun. Once you get far enough away, the monster loses interest and stops chasing you. For right now, the wild monsters don't actually initiate combat if they catch you, and that's because I haven't quite figured out how I want to do that when I'm initiating combat with groups of monsters yet. So that's something that'll have to wait until the next video. But I'm pretty happy with all the progress that's been made, and I really feel like the game is starting to take shape more. I really hope you enjoyed this devlog, and if you did, hit the like button. If you want to see more of these kinds of videos, just go ahead and subscribe, and I'll be looking forward to showing you what I've got next time.